Greeting viewers, I'm Dr. Josephine Lombardi. I'm Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Pastoral and Systematic Theology. And with thanks to ATS for their grant in supporting various presentations on key issues that have an impact on seminary formation, I'm very pleased to welcome today Deacon John Brown. He is a legal and strategic advisor in the area of Indigenous initiatives with the law firm of McCarthy Tétrault. He's going to speak with us today about Indigenous issues and a little bit about the history of residential schools and what we can do to facilitate healing and reconciliation between Indigenous persons and Christians here in Canada. Welcome, Deacon Brown.
Thank you. And thank you for letting me speak on this subject.
Very important subject. Thank you. I thought we'd start by giving you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from.
All right. As you've probably heard from the introduction, I'm a lawyer. I'm a deacon. I'm also Indigenous. My family on my father's side is Stalo from the Fraser River Valley in BC, primarily from Lacamo, Scowlitz, and Schales. I am a status Indian under the Indian Act of Canada, and my spirit name is Young Bear who walks along the shore to protect his family. And so this intersection of lawyer, deacon, and First Nation allows me to gain a unique perspective on the issues we're about to talk about. But to be clear, I can't speak on behalf of all lawyers on this issue. I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, and I can't speak on behalf of all deacons. I can only speak on my own behalf, but I'm happy to do that with you today.
Thank you. And thank you very much for taking the time to share your gifts and your knowledge and your experience with us today. So we'll get started talking a little bit about what led to the creation of residential schools. We've heard quite a bit about it in the news over the last few years. Some are more familiar with the history than others. Do you mind sharing a little bit about what led to the creation of residential schools? What are residential schools and what led to the creation of them?
Certainly. I think the starting point in more current times for anyone who wants a good history of residential schools is the Truth and Reconciliation Report that was released in 2015. It's a bit daunting. It's a 5-volume set, but there is an executive summary that's a couple hundred pages long. And what I'd like to do is just read the opening paragraph from that executive summary, because it summarizes, unfortunately, but very succinctly, what the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have been for probably over 150 years now. So reading from it, for over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. The establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element of this policy, which can best be described as cultural genocide. So that's kind of a concise summary of what I'm going to talk about over the next 35 or 40 minutes. But you should stop and think about those facts just for a moment. Government policy, cultural genocide, Indigenous peoples. And residential schools was the primary tool for trying to achieve those goals. And why I emphasize that is when I describe in a few minutes what happened at those residential schools, there's 2 levels of abuse that occurred. And people sometimes forget the most important first level. And that's that the schools existed at all. Because no matter what kind of treatment the students may have received in the schools, the fact that the schools were aimed at cultural genocide, were aimed at eliminating through the process of assimilation the Aboriginal peoples as a distinct legal, cultural, religious, and racial entity is itself an abuse. And Cardinal Collins made that clear in his apology, which he issued about 3 or 4 years ago. That first level of abuse he gave express recognition to. But in addition to that existence of residential schools level of abuse, there's a secondary, not in terms of importance, but a different second level of abuse, which was the actual physical, sexual, spiritual, and cultural abuse that was inflicted on individual students by individual clergy members of the Catholic Church. And I want, as we go through this, you should keep in mind both those levels of existence, both those levels of abuse. So how did residential schools come to be? Well, ultimately, Canadian government's policy, which was reflected in the creation of residential schools, was how they came to be. And when our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, introduced legislation in Parliament to create residential schools, he stood up and said, residential schools are designed to, quote, take the Indian out of the child. Think about that. But then he went on to say, in this very famous speech, or infamous speech, I might say, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. Now, we all sort of say that could never happen, but it happened. Could never happen today, but in some ways, that same approach to Indigenous people continues to exist in different forms, more nuanced, a little more hidden, but still almost as painful. So, I think when I read that passage, I think about my own relatives or residential school survivors and say, wow, that's the Prime Minister of our country talking about my relatives. So that's the answer to the question, how did residential schools come to be? And the government, of course, looked to the easiest way to facilitate that or implement that legislation. And that was to go to existing infrastructure, which were the Christian churches, Catholics, Anglicans, Baptists, United. And they engaged those churches in this process of creating and running residential schools. And so the federal government would fund it. And the more people or the more students the schools had, of course, the more funding they would get. And so then you had this infrastructure of residential schools funded by a government who didn't adequately supervise any of the process and systematically underfunded the cost of running them. And so it incentivized the churches, including the Catholic Church, to have as many students as possible within their organizations and to spend as little as possible on them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be profitable. And over the years, over 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their homes, usually forcibly or often forcibly, without the consent or the approval of the parents. And in fact, the special agents and the RCMP were given special powers to imprison or fine Indigenous parents who try to resist having their children taken away from them. And if you watch a show called CBC, it'll come back to me. Anyway, so CBC is a CBC show and an APTN show, both of which focus on these issues. And they're quite stunning and compelling in the storytelling. And I'll come back to the names of those in a moment. But this went on for right up until 1996, which is when the last residential school closed. And when the students were taken away, they were usually kept in the schools for up to 10 months of the year. The parents weren't allowed to see them. They weren't allowed to see their parents. And as you can imagine then, all the First Nation reserves were very eerily quiet. Picture your neighborhood where there are no children for 10 months of the year. No voices, no laughter. And this went on for generation after generation after generation. The result being the parents who lost their children never learned really how to be parents. And the children who were at the schools, the only real adult role models they had were the clergy who were trying to assimilate them into the white man European Christian culture by destroying their language, tradition, spirituality, teachings. And so generation after generation, these children would lose contact with everything that they were as Indigenous people, and often would become strangers in their own First Nation reserves because they were gone so long. And when they came back, they couldn't speak, or they were afraid to speak their language or practice their ceremony or their spirituality. Because the teachers, in many ways, would demean the children's parents in a concentrated or concerted effort to destroy the children's links even to their parents. Worse than that, thousands of children didn't survive these ordeals. And you're seeing proof of that in Kamloops and Cranbrook and Mission, BC over the last couple of years, and the Cowessess First Nation and the Kiskakos First Nation in Saskatchewan, and also some First Nations recently in Alberta. Thousands of these children didn't survive these ordeals because of the inhumane conditions that existed at many of them, and because they were all virtually unregulated. Dr. Peter Bryce, he was the medical inspector of the Department of Indian Affairs for Canada, excuse me for a minute. And as early as 1907, he complained to the superintendent as follows: 50% of Indigenous children were dying while at residential schools. Picture that. That was his job, to go out and study this. And the superintendent responded, and I quote, "Well, if they're dying, isn't that the point?" So you can see that even the existence of the schools was a level of abuse in itself. And what compounded many of these issues, that in nearly half the cases when children died, the cause of their death wasn't recorded. And in 32% of the deaths, their names weren't even recorded. And in 25% of the cases, their gender wasn't recorded. So you go one step further. In most cases, the schools did not notify the parents when their children died. And they didn't send the bodies of children back to the First Nations reserves because it was too expensive to do so. For those Indigenous parents then who didn't speak the language, didn't understand the process, didn't know why their children were taken away, the children simply disappeared. And so when you think about the media coverage of unmarked graves at different residential schools in Canada, you get a sense of why that's such a huge issue for First Nations now. So many families even if they knew where the children were taken to attend residential schools, which sometimes they didn't. All of these statistics, all of these facts demonstrate why they didn't know where their children were or how they ended up. And when the children aged out of the schools at age 16, for example, by law, but many were often kept to be indentured servants or otherwise until they were 18, they were essentially given a bus ticket and a few dollars and said, see you later. And then they had to find their way home, wherever that might be. A home where their parents may not be anymore, a home, First Nation reserve where they may not be recognized, where they can't speak the language. A home in which the whole tradition and culture and spirituality had been demeaned and demonified by teachers for so many years. That's what we call, among other things, and you see the intergenerational trauma, because those children then had to find their way in a world that they did not recognize and a world that did not accept them, because there is still this systemic discrimination against them, not just by the government, but still by the churches and by the ordinary citizens. So I've seen firsthand some of the terrible and tragic consequences of the abuse of residential schools. My grandmother and her brothers and sisters were residential school survivors. Many of their children are residential school survivors. Some attended the Kamloops school we've heard so much about, and the St. Mary's School in BC. And they are still struggling to cope with the trauma and the abuse they suffered at these schools, even today. So let me stop there and give you some level of, like a snapshot of what happened at residential schools, for example.
Thank you, Deacon Brown. Wow, what a very sad, tragic history you shared with us, and the impact of the trauma of losing connection with one's parents and one's heritage, the abuse that these young children endured. So very sad and tragic. I wonder, could you share just a bit more about which churches were involved and who did the apprehending? Was it the government that did the apprehending of the children? And which churches in Canada were involved in the residential school system?
I don't want to call out churches that didn't, but most of the Christian churches in Canada did. So the Catholic Church, for sure, the Anglican Church, and the United Church. And the churches and the governments together, there was not one unified or single process across the country for doing this, but the government allowed this to happen and created both the environment and the legal structure so that children could be forcibly seized from their families. But the churches would be there on many occasions with the RCMP or with the local sheriff or the local police to apprehend the children. And they'd run around looking for them. And at times the Catholic or other children's aid societies, they would be out, scouring their jurisdictions for Indigenous children as young as age 3 or 4 years old, and to take them en masse to a residential school that could be 50 or 60 miles away, or sometimes hundreds of miles away.
Wow. Yeah. Again, it's just mind-boggling to think that these kinds of things happened in the recent past, and that we have survivors still living today who are sharing the horrors of their experience and also the impact on their offspring. In one course I teach pastoral counseling, we talk about generational trauma, and In a
Yep.
nutshell, some like to define trauma as an experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope. So not only does the trauma have an impact on the one experiencing the trauma, but we now have research to show it has an impact on the second and third generation. So I wondered, could you share a bit, Deacon Brown, about the impact on offspring of residential school survivors?
Yes, and just before I forget, the one show I spoke about was called Little Bird, and that follows a true story of a Indigenous woman who was taken from the prairies and adopted out to a Montreal couple. And it follows her journey back to find her birth family. And the other show, CBC or CBC Gem, is called Bones of Crows. And it covers residential school story closer to the date that the schools actually existed. Both are excellent, well done. They cover it off, but you have to take it. They're a series, so you have to take them episodes slowly and carefully because they can be overwhelming. So back to your question, intergenerational trauma. Back in 2020, I think it was, when, or maybe I can't remember the year. Anyways, when the Kamloops discovery was made of unmarked graves, and it made headlines across the country, news reports, Globe and Mail, and things like that. There was a makeshift memorial to these children created on the stairs of the Vancouver Museum. And it consisted of 250 pairs of children's shoes of various sizes and shapes to honor all 250 unmarked graves that had been found. My cousin, Lorelei Williams, and her father is the creator of all the art behind me, George Penier. My cousin Lorelei Williams is an activist for the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And she was there helping to create this memorial. And another cousin of mine, whose mother was a residential school survivor, Siam Williams, was in Victoria. And they were discussing this discovery and the memorial on FaceTime for about half an hour. And during that discussion, they were both in tears because the parents of both of them were residential school survivors. They were the next generation. They were the ones that were suffering in this intergenerational trauma. And they both talked about the community at large and how losing one child in this way for a community was heart-wrenching. But to lose other children you knew could have been your relatives was equally or more heart-wrenching. And they talked about how difficult it was for their parents to raise them because their parents were residential school survivors. And the struggles their parents had just coping with life generally, let alone coping with how to be a good parent because they never learned how to do that. And they talked about the struggles that they, as the children of residential school survivors, the struggles they had to endure in order to survive themselves. And how, in the case of Lorelei, who has two children, how she had to struggle mightily to ensure she didn't inflict on her own children some of the trauma she received from her parents unintentionally because they were residential school survivors. And how they were both hopeful that the next generation will be one more generation removed from that trauma. And that their next generation, their children will grow to be strong, independent, proud members of their Indigenous communities, something which was so difficult for so many, many years for so many Indigenous people. And I think we're seeing some of that now. This current young generation of Indigenous youth are probably the strongest and the most proud, and in many ways, the most accomplished generation. And they are achieving great things for Indigenous people, but it's just the beginning of trying to recover from what was inflicted on them and their parents and their grandparents in residential schools. Take, for example, Wab Kinew, the current Premier of Manitoba, right? What he's achieved now. And the lawyers and law students we have at our firm, many of them who apply are the first members of their extended families who have gone on to university, let alone to law school. One, because of the systemic discrimination that's been imposed on First Nations peoples forever by the federal government. And two, because schools, understandably, were something to be feared because of the residential school experience. And so now they're coming out of that, and we're seeing more and more Indigenous students going to university and going to law school, which is fantastic. But it's a long process, and many of them still carry that intergenerational trauma with them. And when you speak about pastoral care, and we'll get to this, I think, later on in this discussion, it's that background, sensitivity to why the Indigenous people are the way they are when they come to you for pastoral care, why you have to recognize this.
Yes, that's so very important, especially with what we know now about children in those first 3 years of life. Some researchers refer to those first 3 years of life as the fourth trimester, and how early nurture and good routines and stability in one's family and just learning how to attach and create intimate bonds and how to be emotionally attuned with someone. But if you've removed a child from that opportunity to receive that nurture and that care, it's going to have an impact on their ability to form intimate relations as they get older. So absolutely, we need to be very trauma informed when it comes to pastoral care and when it comes to our educational approach.
And on that point, even after residential schools were being unwound, they had the 60s scoop. And that's when the children's aid societies, with the government's approval, were able to come in and simply, write a letter saying this child's at risk. But measured against white Christian male concept of what is a good upbringing and a good way to raise your children. But they'd remove like 20,000 children from whatever age. And that created a system where there was, anytime a child who had been in care went on to have a child themselves, the hospitals were required to notify the children's aid societies, and they'd show up at the hospital when the new child was born, when there's no history of anything, and simply say, because mother was a child in care, the new child is likely at risk as well. And then the onus was put on the Indigenous mother and father to demonstrate to an unsympathetic, uncaring, and uninformed court system why they should be allowed to raise their own child. So it carried on right to the 60s and in the 80s. It was currently there are more Indigenous children in the child welfare system than there ever was in residential schools. In Manitoba, the Indigenous population is about 5%, but 50% of the children in the child welfare system are Indigenous. That's what I mean by the systemic discrimination still seeps through many of our systems, government and otherwise, even today.
Well, I was aware of the 60s scoop and also aware of the forced adoptions that took place 50s, 60s, 70s, well into the 80s of young unmarried women, but I was not aware of the attempted apprehension of offspring of victims of the 60s scoop.
Yep.
Wow, shocking.
It is.
Important for people to be aware of the history, and you're certainly helping us to understand all the unique struggles that Indigenous persons have experienced, especially here in Canada. And so I'm wondering, Deacon Brown, if you can help us to understand what needs to be addressed then in order to facilitate greater healing and reconciliation.
That's a big question. I know we don't have time to cover it all. That'd be like me asking you, how can you administer effectively a pastoral ministry to the people in your parish? And I know you teach long and extensive and very good courses on this, so I know you couldn't summarize it in 10 or 15 minutes. But I'll try to focus on one issue. I mentioned before how the clergy demeaned and the culture and tradition and language of the Indigenous people. But they also, and more importantly, demeaned and ridiculed Indigenous spirituality. And so the intersection of truth and reconciliation and the Catholic Church really meets most forcefully on the issue of spirituality. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report has 94 calls to action, as you probably know, and calls to action, I think it's 58 to 61, are directed expressly to the Catholic Church. And one of the call to action 61, I believe it is, calls upon the Catholic Church to recognize Indigenous spirituality as a significant and important aspect of Indigenous life. So far from ridiculing and demeaning it as they did for years and years in residential schools, the church has to swing 180 degrees. And it has the opportunity now, we have the opportunity now to do better. When Cardinal Collins apologized for the abuse in the Catholic Church, he apologized for the spiritual abuse. When the Pope apologized at large and described what the Indigenous people endured in residential schools, he also apologized for the spiritual abuse. And he referred to it as not just cultural genocide, but genocide. And more recently, the Cardinal Collins has stated publicly, we have to, as Catholics, understand and appreciate, have a greater appreciation of Indigenous spirituality. So if I could, if I stop there just for a moment, make an important point, because this often comes up. You get a little bit of this reconciliation fatigue, as sometimes my parishioners, sometimes other groups I speak to say, why are we still talking about this? Right? What, like, we weren't there. We didn't do it. We had nothing to do with it. And this is a point that Cadmus Delorum, former chief of Cowess's First Nation, addressed in one of his events in Toronto last summer. And he said this: none of us today in this room, or probably in your audience, created or operated residential schools. And none of us today are to blame for the schools or the harm they caused. That's recognized. However, all of us have inherited the fractured relationship that exists today between the church and the Indigenous people because of the way the church treated the Indigenous people. And we are all part of the church. And that's not to lay blame. That's just to say we've inherited that relationship. And the point I just made, we can do something about that. We can do something to heal that relationship. How? By recognizing that Indigenous people are hurting today, they're still hurting, and that healing is needed. So when we talk about truth and reconciliation, the truth we've talked about for the last 20 minutes or so, what really happened. You need to know that to understand why healing is necessary. And the reconciliation that we're working on now is all about healing the fractured relationship. And so in a phrase, reconciliation is about hope. Hope the Catholic Church can heal relationship with the Indigenous people as we go forward. And as I said, the intersection that is where it's most keenly or acutely needed is when it comes to spirituality. Now, I can talk a little bit about why that's important, if you like, and how we might be able to deal with it, and how the Catholic Church, both the lay people and the clergy, can address or at least become more aware of the need to, as Cardinal Collins put it, gain a better understanding and appreciation of Indigenous spirituality.
Yes, I think that's very important, especially because we talk about the need to cultivate empathy in seminary formation and even in lay formation for those who are in training to be psychotherapists or counselors. And to be empathic, you need to know how to acknowledge what someone's feeling, to acknowledge their family of origin issues, to restate those feelings back, to show that you've listened and you're acknowledging what someone's feeling. And so that's so very important. So please, I think it would be very helpful to us to learn how to express, and perhaps if any kind of skills that we should acquire or any concrete examples on how to do that. Thank you.
Okay. So back to the Truth and Reconciliation Report again. And the Truth and Reconciliation Report has a couple of important statements. Here's one of them. That for many residential school survivors, reconnecting with traditional Indigenous spiritual teachings and practices has been essential to their healing. It goes on to say this: losing the connections to their languages and cultures in the residential schools had devastating impacts on survivors, their families and communities. Land, language, culture, and identity are inseparable from spirituality. All are necessary elements of a whole way of being. Okay? And the other statement, churches bear a particular responsibility to formally recognize Indigenous spirituality as a valid form of worship that is equal to its own. Without such formal recognition, a full and robust reconciliation will be impossible. Healing and reconciliation have a spiritual dimension that must continue to be addressed by the churches in partnership with Indigenous spiritual leaders and communities. So think about those statements for a moment. They're very powerful statements, and they may, in some people's minds, bump up against what our Catholic faith is all about. But our Catholic faith is a faith that is inclusive. It's a faith of welcoming everyone, of loving everyone as Jesus does. And that means you have to create and maintain a mutually respectful relationship with each other. And in order to create and maintain such a mutually respectful relationship with Indigenous people, you have to respect their culture and their tradition and their spirituality. And you can't be afraid of Indigenous spirituality. I mean, I've done smudging ceremonies with the Cardinal at the cathedral twice. I've done it at St. Basil's Church. I've done it up in the Archdiocese of Peterborough. I've done it in my own parish in Mississauga. And questions are raised. But I say, the Cardinal has done it with me. It's okay. You can do it. This is part of respecting Indigenous spirituality. So sometimes when I preach, I hold my eagle feather, which is a gift from I received years ago. You see underneath the drum the cedar box, and it's full of cedar boughs, and on those cedar boughs rests my eagle feather. And I hold it up during some of my homilies and my presentations, and I say to the congregation, I said, allowing me to hold my eagle feather is respecting my Indigenous spirituality. The eagle flies closest to heaven, closest to Creator. It brings me strength when I'm talking. Don't be afraid of that. I say to them, Indigenous people, most Indigenous people have two fundamental principles. They believe in the Creator. We know him or her as God. And they believe that you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. Fundamental principles, right? And some other example I give you, which is, I show them, I have my prayer beads. I don't know if you can see these. I have on my right wrist. And they reflect the values I live by to live a good life as a Christian. And we all know those probably as the Beatitudes. So things like humility, bravery, righteousness, compassion, mercifulness, purity of heart, and peacemaking. And I wear at my left wrist, these are the 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe people. And what are they? Love, respect, bravery, honesty, wisdom, truth, and humility. You can hear the overlap. And I say to them, I live by all of these principles, my Christian principles and my Indigenous spirituality principles, to lead a good life. And they don't clash, they don't conflict. They shouldn't cause anyone to be afraid. I said, respect the fact that I've reconciled being an Indigenous person with being a deacon. Respect the fact that I've reconciled that in my own self. I still do it have to do it every day, of course, because but I could do it. It can be done. Confirmation name. We all got a confirmation name. Whatever it was, you're supposed to live up to the role model that saint's name reflects. I told you in the beginning, I have a spirit name. The spirit name is given to me by a spiritual leader or elder in the Indigenous community. And my obligation is to live up to that name. Young bear who walks along the shore to protect his family. Kind of like what a deacon does, you know? So nothing to be afraid there. And there's other examples of how Indigenous spirituality is nothing to be afraid of. And so you can understand, you put that in the context to what Cardinal Collins has said about it and what the Pope has said about it. And you realize that they practice a similar way of living and of approaching the world. And they're both good ways of doing it. And as Catholics, we should strive to do that, because that's part of loving your neighbor as you love yourself. That's part of creating and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. So when I speak to the seminarians or the deacon candidates and things like that, I try to walk them through that. I make them smudge too. You know what smudging is? It's an Indigenous ceremony where you cleanse your mind and your heart and your soul of all things bad or evil, so you can proceed in your meeting or in whatever you're doing in a good way. And sometimes it's tricky business to do it, but I say it's okay. Embrace it and demonstrate to the Indigenous people that that we are, because I get to put my deacon hat on now, that we are a welcoming, accepting church. We're not here to ridicule or demean what you do anymore, or tell you shouldn't be doing it. We're here to help you embrace your Indigenous spirituality, because we recognize it is a key part of your healing process, which is part of reconciliation, which is part of our journey of hope. Let me stop there for a moment and let you ask any other follow-up questions you might have.
Wow, well, thank you. You certainly have given us hope. Your life witness gives us hope. Your influence gives us hope, and your courage gives us hope. And all those beautiful similarities that you shared with us reminds me of a key teaching document from Vatican II on dialogue with other faiths. And in that key teaching document, we hear that the church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other faiths. So and
Yes.
you shared so many beautiful similarities, and you're encouraging us to approach dialogue without fear, to approach with great courage and with love and the desire to heal and to reconcile. So thank you so very much for your powerful witness. I thought maybe we'd end with, in case someone's listening and the content that we've shared may bring certain moments from their past to mind, or their early formative years, a reminder that we do have skilled, trained, registered, licensed psychotherapists who can help you with that journey of healing. There are spiritual directors as well that can accompany you on your spiritual journey, staying close to the sacraments, the Word of God, God's grace, the power of intercessory prayer. So knowing you are not alone, that there are qualified individuals, perhaps in your place of employment. If you're a layperson listening, you have maybe an employee assistance program where there are counseling services available to you. But whether you're in the Archdiocese of Toronto or in another diocese, if you have Catholic Family Services or a family ministry office, I have no doubt that there's someone in these offices who can help you, can refer you to someone who can help you with this journey of healing and reconciliation. So on that note, Deacon Brown, any final comments?
Only this. Please have the courage to journey with us on our path of hope and healing, because together we'll be so much stronger in so many ways, and there'll be less fear or love among us.
That's beautiful. And again, how education, knowledge of these issues helps to remove much of the fear. So thank you so
Yes.
very much, for sharing that. Well, on that note, again, thank you for sharing your story, where you're from, and how you're using your gifts and your credentials to help other individuals to flourish in their own context. So thank you very much, Deacon Brown, and thanks to all the listeners. I hope you share the video with anyone who may need to learn and grow in knowledge in this area. Thank you, and God bless.
Miigwech, Kwasai.